In a dramatic courtroom showdown, the tension was palpable as Karoline Leavitt faced off with the judge, an encounter that would send shockwaves through the legal world and beyond. What transpired in those 4 minutes would not only alter the course of the trial, but also ignite the unraveling of a powerful empire, one that many believed was untouchable. Karoline Leavitt, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for ruthlessness in the courtroom, had long been seen as an indomitable force in the legal system. She was known for her sharp wit, her calculated approach, and her ability to sway even the most steadfast judges to her side. But on this fateful day, she found herself on the other side of the bench, facing a judge who wasn't going to bend to her will. The case at hand was one of immense importance, a legal battle that had far-reaching implications, not just for those directly involved, but for the empire built around it. The judge, a man who had served with distinction for over 2 decades, had earned a reputation for fairness, impartiality, and a deep understanding of the law. But no one could have predicted that the events unfolding in his courtroom would set in motion the collapse of everything he had built. The courtroom was filled with spectators, all watching in anticipation as Karoline Leavitt, poised and confident, presented her arguments. She spoke with the precision of a seasoned litigator, her voice unwavering as she laid out her case. But as she reached the critical point in her argument, something shifted in the atmosphere. The judge, a man who had long been known for his stoic demeanor, suddenly erupted. Without warning, the judge slammed his gavel down with incredible force, his voice booming through the room. "Enough," he declared, his face reddened with anger. "This courtroom will not be turned into a circus. You will respect the process and adhere to the rules of law." For a moment, there was stunned silence. Karoline, who had been known to dominate any courtroom she entered, was momentarily caught off guard. Her usually composed expression faltered, and for the first time in years, she was forced to reckon with someone who wouldn't bend to her will. The judge's words stung, not just because they were a rebuke of her actions, but because they signified something deeper. Her control over the courtroom had been challenged, and the consequences of that challenge were about to unfold in ways no one could have imagined. The room was thick with tension as Karoline attempted to regain her composure. She took a deep breath, her mind racing as she searched for the right words to recover from the judge's outburst. But before she could respond, the judge's gavel came down once more, a clear indication that he was not finished with her. "Do not test my patience further," he warned, his voice low but firm. "I will not tolerate any more disruptions." At this point, the dynamic in the courtroom had completely shifted. Karoline, who had once commanded the room with ease, now found herself on the defensive. Her reputation, her authority, everything she had worked so hard to build, was being called into question in front of an audience that included not only legal professionals, but also powerful figures from various industries. What happened next would forever change the trajectory of the trial and, ultimately, the fate of the judge's empire. Just 4 minutes after that explosive confrontation, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted once again. The judge, who had been steadfast in his ruling, began to show signs of strain. His once unshakable composure began to crack, his words growing increasingly erratic. His gavel strikes, which had been once measured and deliberate, now came in, quick, panicked succession. Those in the courtroom could sense that something was deeply wrong. Whispers spread quickly among the spectators, with some wondering if the judge had made a critical mistake, if his temper had cost him more than just the trial. As the minutes passed, it became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary legal proceeding. The judge, once a figure of authority, now seemed out of control. Within moments, it became apparent that the judge's actions had triggered a chain reaction. His empire, built over decades of influence and respect, was beginning to collapse. His decisions, once revered, were now being scrutinized with intense scrutiny. Legal professionals, once eager to align themselves with him, began to distance themselves. Powerful entities with vested interests in the outcome of the trial saw an opportunity to strike. Within 4 minutes, the judge's grip on power had slipped away. The courtroom, once filled with the air of authority, now buzzed with the scent of impending collapse. News outlets, legal experts, and observers from all walks of life were quick to pick up on the unfolding drama. The judge's empire, which had seemed unassailable just moments before, was beginning to crumble in real time. The repercussions were felt beyond the courtroom. Legal proceedings that had been slated to take place under the judge's leadership were suddenly called into question. The very foundation of his career, his credibility, his reputation, was in jeopardy. In a matter of minutes, everything he had worked for was unraveling, and there was no turning back. Karoline Leavitt, on the other hand, though initially stunned by the judge's outburst, found herself in a rare position of power. Her calmness, under pressure, her ability to regain composure, and her ability to remain focused while the judge's empire crumbled around her was a testament to her skill as an attorney. Despite the chaos in the courtroom, Karoline held her ground, her confidence slowly returning as she saw the unraveling of a once dominant figure before her. By the time the trial concluded, the fallout from that brief moment of confrontation was undeniable. The judge, once a revered figure in the legal world, was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered empire. His decisions were called into question, his actions scrutinized, and his once untouchable influence now teetering on the brink of collapse. The legal world watched in awe as the courtroom drama unfolded, a stark reminder that even the most powerful empires can crumble in an instant. For Karoline Leavitt, this trial would go down in history as a turning point, not just in her career, but in the legal world as a whole. The judge may have struck first, but it was his empire that ultimately paid the price for underestimating the power of a determined adversary. As the days passed, the repercussions of that courtroom showdown rippled through the legal community and beyond. The media, always eager for a dramatic story, seized upon the events and began to dissect them from every angle. Headlines blared about the sudden downfall of a once respected judge, with speculation running rampant about what had caused such a dramatic shift in his demeanor and authority. For the judge, the aftermath was nothing short of catastrophic. His previous rulings, once considered impeccable, were now questioned. Legal professionals who had once revered his decisions now looked at them with skepticism. His integrity, so carefully cultivated over decades, was suddenly under a microscope, and the public's perception of him began to fracture. The whispers turned into loud calls for investigations into his conduct, both in this trial and in past cases where his judgments had been pivotal. Behind closed doors, the judge's allies who had supported him for years began to distance themselves. The powerful legal networks that had once protected him now sought to distance themselves from the controversy. Those who had previously benefited from his rulings feared that associating with him would be seen as a liability. The judge's empire of influence, which had been built on years of meticulous decisions, strategic alliances, and unwavering control, was crumbling at an alarming pace. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt, though calm in the eye of the storm, knew that her victory wasn't just personal, it was strategic. Her ability to keep her composure under the intense pressure of the situation had proven to be her greatest strength. While the judge's empire fell apart, Karoline's reputation soared. She was hailed as a master strategist, someone who had not only withstood an intense confrontation, but had turned the tide in a trial that many thought was already lost. Her career took on a new trajectory. Law firms, corporate entities, and influential clients began to approach her, eager to align themselves with someone who had demonstrated such resilience and sharp intellect. She quickly became one of the most sought-after attorneys in the industry. The courtroom victory that had once seemed like just another case now became the foundation of an ever-expanding career, and Karoline capitalized on the attention with an unwavering focus. But the consequences of the judge's downfall extended far beyond the legal world. As the media storm intensified, politicians, influencers, and high-ranking officials began to weigh in. Some voiced support for the judge, decrying the events as a temporary lapse in judgment, while others claimed that his actions were a symptom of a much larger issue within the judicial system. The public was divided, with many calling for greater accountability and transparency in the legal system, while others saw this as a rare victory for justice being served. The judge's own mental state continued to deteriorate as the weeks wore on. The pressure from both the media and his former supporters took its toll. Once a figure who had commanded respect with a single glance, he now found himself besieged by an avalanche of public scrutiny. His once pristine career was now stained by the very incident he had believed would affirm his authority. His fall from grace was swift, and those who had once rallied behind him began to withdraw. In courtrooms across the country, attorneys, judges, and legal scholars debated the fallout from the case. Some argued that the judge's behavior was an anomaly, a momentary lapse in judgment that didn't define his career, while others pointed to it as evidence of deeper, systemic issues within the judicial system. Karoline Leavitt's name became synonymous with justice and determination, her victory not just a personal triumph, but a symbol of the power of integrity in the face of adversity. For the judge, his legacy was forever altered. Where once he had been a towering figure in the legal world, his name became associated with scandal and failure. Despite attempts to salvage his career, the damage was done. The collapse of his empire wasn't just the result of a single outburst in the courtroom. It was the culmination of years of unchecked power, hubris, and a belief that he could control every outcome. In the end, it wasn't Karoline Leavitt's legal skills that brought him down, but his own inability to adapt to the changing dynamics of the courtroom. As for Karoline, the future looked brighter than ever. She became a symbol of what it meant to stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds. Her ability to rise above the chaos and turn it into an opportunity was something that many admired. And while the legal world continued to buzz with discussions about the judge's fall, Karoline's career flourished. Her name was no longer just known in legal circles. It was recognized in the highest echelons of business, politics, and society. Her victory served as a stark reminder that power in the courtroom isn't about dominating others. It's about maintaining respect for the process, for the law, and for the pursuit of justice. The judge's empire had collapsed not because of Karoline's attack, but because of his own failure to remember these fundamental principles. And in that short, tense moment in the courtroom, when Karoline's poise met the judge's fury, the tides of power shifted, and the empire that once seemed invincible was laid to rest. In the end, the courtroom drama that had unfolded in just a few minutes left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The judge, once at the pinnacle of his profession, was left to reckon with the aftermath of his own downfall. And Karoline Leavitt, though facing challenges of her own, emerged as a powerful force in the legal world, her career destined for heights few could have predicted. As the months passed, the echoes of that fateful courtroom battle continued to reverberate throughout the legal world. The case had become a defining moment, not only for Karoline Leavitt, but for the entire judicial system. The media coverage persisted, and what had initially been a scandal began to take on a deeper cultural significance. It became a symbol of the shifting power dynamics in the courtroom, where authority could no longer be wielded unchallenged, and where an individual's actions, whether they were an attorney or a judge, could have far-reaching consequences. Karoline, now widely regarded as a legal trailblazer, capitalized on her newfound prominence. Her phone rang constantly, with high-profile clients, influential figures, and law firms all eager to align with her. She quickly transitioned from a well-respected lawyer to a cultural icon of resilience and justice. Public speaking invitations poured in from conferences and events all over the country, where her story was shared as a masterclass in strategy, emotional intelligence, and maintaining grace under pressure. However, despite the external success, Karoline remained grounded in her roots. She never forgot the lessons she had learned from the courtroom battle. For Karoline, the trial was more than just a victory. It was a reminder of the importance of integrity and the necessity of knowing when to challenge the system. She understood that in a world where power structures are often unchallenged, the courage to question authority could be the key to lasting change. Her ascent, however, did not come without its challenges. With great power came increased scrutiny. Karoline's every move, her every statement was dissected by the media and the public. Her critics, of course, existed. Some believed that her rise to fame was too fast, too meteoric. Others questioned the manner in which she handled the confrontation with the judge. But Karoline, having faced the worst of it all during that courtroom encounter, took it all in stride. She knew that with every triumph, there would be detractors. And she knew that her success wasn't just about silencing her critics, it was about remaining steadfast in her values and continuing to push for justice. Meanwhile, the judge, once revered and respected, faced a much different path. His attempts to regain control over his tarnished reputation were futile. The investigations into his conduct only revealed more unsettling truths about his past decisions, creating a wave of legal challenges that sent shockwaves through the judicial system. Whispers of corruption, bias, and ethical violations began to dominate the discourse surrounding his career. His once staunch supporters, including prominent political figures and corporate allies, began to sever ties, unwilling to associate with a man whose credibility had been irrevocably damaged. The media frenzy continued, but now the narrative had shifted. No longer was the conversation focused on the dramatic moment between Karoline and the judge in the courtroom. Instead, it became a larger conversation about the failures within the judicial system and how power structures often go unchecked. Legal experts debated the role of authority and accountability in the courts, questioning whether certain figures had become too entrenched in their positions of power and whether that had led to corruption and the erosion of public trust. Now Karoline had become an influential figure not just in legal circles, but in broader societal discussions. She was invited to panel discussions about the need for judicial reform, the importance of checks and balances within the legal system, and the necessity of transparency and accountability. Karoline's voice became one that was sought after, respected, and listened to. She no longer just represented clients. She represented the ideals of fairness and justice, fighting for those who felt their voices had been silenced by a system that had failed them. Through it all, Karoline's focus remained clear. She continued to build her legal career while also taking on more significant roles in policy advocacy. Her efforts began to reshape the public's view of what justice could and should look like. The judge, on the other hand, found himself in a downward spiral that he could never recover from. No matter how many apologies or public statements he issued, the damage was done. His empire, built on years of respect and power, had vanished in the blink of an eye, and there was no rebuilding it. As the years went on, the story of Karoline Leavitt's courtroom victory continued to be retold as a defining moment in legal history. It became an iconic example of how one person, with enough courage and determination, could challenge a system that seemed invincible. It was the story of a woman who stood up against a powerful figure, unafraid to face the consequences of challenging the status quo. And it was a story that showed that sometimes the collapse of one empire paves the way for the rise of something greater, something more just. While Karoline Leavitt's journey was far from over, the lessons learned in that courtroom remained etched in her mind. She knew that success was not just about winning cases. It was about fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And as she continued her work, both in the courtroom and beyond, she knew that the fight for justice was far from finished. The collapse of the judge's empire had set a powerful example of the consequences of unchecked power. Now it was up to Karoline, and those like her, to ensure that the system would continue to evolve in the direction of fairness, transparency, and accountability.